All right, welcome everyone. We are here today to talk about application security. So before we jump onto it, just to level set and make sure we set our expectations, this podcast slash podcast, we have people on video. It is targeted for those companies, people, professionals, practitioners who are either just starting their application security journey or trying to mature it, but not there yet. That advanced user is not the target audience for this one. However, our panelists, they are very experts and advanced in application security. Some of you may know them from their community work. I want to start with Dan. Dan has founded API Security, API Sec University, and has done how many? Dan, how many users you already have so far for API Sec?
Yeah, we launched it about 18 months ago with our first course. Now we're up to about 10 courses and 75,000 students. And yeah, it's really been quite remarkable.
Look at that. Awesome. We have Jeremy Ventura. Jeremy is well known in SoCal community. He's been evangelist for API security or application security in general. Jeremy, quick introduction, and then we'll pass it around. Actually, I skipped the introduction. Let's do introductions. Actually, Jeremy, go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, Victor, and thanks for having me here today. I look forward to speaking with Dan and Carl. Yep, Jeremy Ventura, as we mentioned. So I am the field CISO for a company called Myriad 360, which is a VAR and systems integrator out of New York City. A little bit about my background. Close to the topic today, I've been involved in API and application security throughout my career and holding many different roles, working on red side and the blue team side, from being an incident response consultant to advisory and field CISO type of work. So look forward to today's conversation.
Awesome. Carl, we'll come to you. Sorry, I skipped Dan's actual introduction. Dan, give us your quick introductions.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, so I helped found AppySec University a year and a half ago. It was kind of a crazy flyer of an idea. My buddy Corey Ball and I, we just decided to throw a course or two together, and it really touched a nerve. So I mentioned we're up to 75,000 students, most of the Fortune 100. Highly recommend anyone who wants to learn about API security, come check it out. It's all free. There's no pitches or anything like that. The company that I work for that gives me the freedom to be able to do AppySec University is a company called appysec.ai. We do technology that does API security testing, and happy to tell you more about that. But that's what we're up to here.
Awesome. So, Carl, we did a podcast / webinar with him. We had 17,000 viewers, and they wanted to see more Carl. So I brought Carl again to give insights about application security and all. Carl, give us your quick introduction, where you work today and what have you been up to?
Good to see you again, Victor. And again, I'm Carl Matson. I'm the CISO for No Name Security. I've spent about 2 years as the internal CISO. Now I've sort of semi-retired into the field CISO role, which means that I'm sort of customer facing. So my role is essentially to talk about, as a practitioner, things that we need to do, technology process to get organizations ready, security programs, and then see them through a journey towards that objective. So we are also an API security technology company, but my role is largely about organizational departments. How do we ready our departments of teams of people to be capable application security programs? So my role now, since the last time we switched, is entirely externally facing. So I no longer get the text message at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, because I now have a counterpart, Mike Morato, who's I would call him the real CISO. So
yeah, I think I'm sure you don't miss it, and at the same time, smartest move, Carl.
Yeah.
For those who've been there, I know that they'll all say that yes, it looks shiny and flashy when you have a CISO title. It's really that you feel CISO is what you want. But anyways, more on that one over drink sometimes. Let's jump right into it, gentlemen. As I said, the target audience is for those who are starting their journey with application security. Let's talk about visibility to start with. If I am someone who just are trying to build a program at my company for application security, and there is so much out there, and thank you, AppySec for University for guiding those students and for those practitioners, what are my top 3 things that I should start with for visibility in application security? Jeremy, we'll start with you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think, like a lot of other areas and other sectors within cybersecurity and technology in general, it comes down to visibility and discovery, right? Knowing what is on or off your network, who has access to that, to be able to protect that, right? It's that famous quote, you don't know what you don't know, right? You can't protect what you don't know. And so from a visibility standpoint, it's super critical first to really get an understanding of where we were in the past and where we've come as an entire industry. And, when we think about applications, we think about kind of what is that connected tissue to applications. We've mentioned a bunch of times APIs or application programming interfaces, right? That has exploded, especially in the last couple of years, as organizations worldwide have really moved and started to migrate more resources and applications into the cloud. And so when it comes into that, I think the biggest thing is around discovering who has access to what are your most critical applications, where are they found, where are they stored, what data, what is their intended use, whether that's an application that's servicing your HR department or it's an application that's homegrown and it's providing for our clients. We need to understand all the different mechanisms within there. And we'll get more into that, but it's really first from my point of view and perspective to really understand kind of what's happened recently, right? Through this digital transformation and different initiatives that organizations have done and how it's just exploded. I know recently Gartner said that, API security, I believe, grew almost 85% just in the last 6 months, right? And APIs in general, just how many resources, how much our engineering teams and resources are leveraging these things. And so, I also like to say with increased usage comes increased risk. And I know these gentlemen will talk a little bit more from their perspectives as well, but really it's understanding what's on that network, what's at your perimeter, what's at your edge, and trying to document and catalog that from step one.
Yeah, well said. I think you're absolutely right. Recently, everybody's using APIs either for connections or for some sort of automation, or it could be as simple as we're exchanging data. And Carl, you help your internal teams, and as your practitioner days, you always talked about visibility and detection. When it comes to APIs, sometimes it seems so easy to make a connection. The developer or the application security person, they won't even realize what they are agreeing to. So what are your thoughts when you're telling the novice, if you will, that, hey, when you're starting your journey with application security, API security, what are 3 things that you want to be mindful of?
Well, I think the first thing, I mean, there's a couple of things we could dive into, but I'd say the first thing I want to be mindful of is as a practitioner, we have to choose our instruments carefully. And I think that what we commonly do in technology and security roles is we look for the right microscope for our problem. And so let's say that Noname is a microscope to inspect an API or its quality or its design. I say put down the microscope and grab a telescope instead. What I mean by telescope is, yes, there are technologies we can choose that like look at an asset and see is it configured well. But really what I want to start with is I want to start with a microscope that looks at, for example, like the whole of the ecosystem. And a telescope might be, for example, using a NIST framework or using an OWASP SAM model, the software assurance maturity model. Let me look at the whole of the software development ecosystem and identify, for example, like what kind of framework that we're using as an organization, what kind of policies do we have, and look at the big picture of software development lifecycle. So before I choose the microscope of my Noname, it's the telescope first. Look at the whole of software development, and I love the industry's available maturity models right now from OWASP, NIST, Cloud Security Alliance even has some nice stuff. I think of leaning into those first before getting into like technical selection for observability. Usually serves everybody well because what it does is then it informs, for example, that we're looking across our software landscape and we're making good choices about prioritization, staffing, tooling, those kinds of things. So yeah, that's my first order of business is to choose a telescope, like a framework to look at application security.
I love it. I might use it next time when the students ask me, hey, can you show me how to do hacking using Kali? And my sentiments towards that is always like, yes, that's what and how, but why are you doing it? What exactly you're trying to achieve?
Perfect. Yep.
Find the why. And usually I align with MITRE ATT&CK framework that find the techniques and tactics that you're trying to actually first visualize the adversary is trying to get to you. And then you will learn how they are actually coming to you, then procedures, then you get into the level of what and how first learn why part. So yeah, I totally love the idea. Telescope and microscope. Then you spent recent years building content for AppySec University and teaching about API security. Give us that elevator pitch. How would you convince someone who's just getting into the application security that thinks that they need to consider?
Oh, geez, it's not that hard to convince folks. We start a lot of our sessions, our workshops, with just 3 basic facts, right? So the first is just the API adoption, right? There's the much quoted 83% of the internet is API traffic. Is that the right number? I don't know, but it's a great big number, and it basically points to the massive adoption of APIs, and that's no surprise to anyone. It's powering everything, right? So great. There's a ton of APIs out there. Number 2, the breaches that are happening, right? So a lot of folks talk about the Gartner quote: APIs will be the #1 most frequent attack vector. All right, that's a nice quote, but the proof is in the pudding. I don't know. I bet most of these gentlemen on the call, like me, have their API breach Google alert that fires every single day. It's really quite remarkable just how many and how frequent they are. And then we spent a lot of time at AppySecU kind of looking at like, well, what's going on here, right? And how do we provide some education and awareness? And so we have some nice intro level courses if you don't know anything, all the way up to really, hardcore advanced pen testing courses. But what's interesting is if you look at the breaches that are actually happening out there, the ones that get publicized and a lot of visibility, there tends to be, a lot of commonality between them, right? We see a lot of authorization flaws, which is OWASP number 1, right? Can I access Victor's records, right? That's really common, right? That's basically a data logic flaw, right? We see that quite a bit. We see a ton of authentication flaws, right? Where people just leave the door unlocked, right? And why would you do that? Well, developers are busy, they got a lot of pressure pushing code out there. And there's this belief that APIs are kind of this thing off in the background that no one can see or pay attention to. And actually attackers are very much looking at it. And then the data exposure side, that's OWASP 3, right? Like what kind of, there's this concept in open banking of least information required, right? So you should be building your APIs to that standard, right? What's the minimum amount of information you can provide to satisfy the business requirement? And so, there's plenty of other dimensions we could talk about, but it turns out that if you can address those elements to start, right, you've radically improved your security posture right away, right? And we do a lot of workshops for organizations where we talk about what's behind these breaches, what are the main causes. And I've had developers at the end of these workshops kind of chime in and say, holy cow, I already know some code I got to go fix. Right. You've opened my eyes. I've seen what happened at X and Y and Z. Yeah. And now that OWASP is a whole lot more tangible to me. Right. Like I get when you just read the OWASP, 1 through 10, it's kind of dry. It's a little bit boring. But when you put it in the context of what happens in the real world, it becomes quite compelling.
Yeah, for sure. I know every organization, we can have this conversation and it'll just die down. But the minute you attach any dollar value, then everybody's listening. Even non-technical people, even those business users, business leaders, executives, you attach a dollar value to your conversation, now everybody's invested. So there's actually statistics from CloudWard that cybercrime damages are anticipating to reach around $6 trillion. And primarily, they'll be using the flaws in applications. Now, that's something that everybody wants to listen. Okay, there's a financial impact to it. But at the same time, when it comes to really using SDLC, CI/CD pipeline, and all that, people have their golden standards and they have what practicing in their organization. Carl, when you're talking to your customers or even your internal folks, engineers, what are the things that you have to convince them to make sure that they are using the right ways of CI/CD pipeline and injecting security at the right time is effective than after the fact?
there's a piece of messaging that I continue to hammer on, just to some degree of success so far, but which is the developers and product owners. They are very aware of their responsibilities to produce quality software that performs well, that actually does the thing that it's supposed to do. So the idea of quality is natural to a developer. They want their software to work and they want it to perform under stress. And so what I think what I try to do is I try to lean into that aspect of quality and say, well, security is just another aspect of quality. It's having a product, having a software that has integrity. And so when we can have that developer or product manager think about security as just like one other aspect of the overall health and quality of the product they're building, there's a lot more adoption of the idea that it is their responsibility to tackle that as part of a development practice. When it's the security team tossing over findings over the wall via PDF, and it's a bunch of false positives, like that's just a recipe for failure, obviously. And so that's the language I try to use. I try to use the language of quality as the lure and say, like, look, you're already doing you already care about quality. And then here's another attributes of quality of good code development that we really think that we can bake that in early. And I think that's a recipe for success for us long term. Is if we have that dialogue with development teams about quality and less so about kind of like the hypothetical fear. Just build good software, make it healthy, have it in integrity. I think that's a good message.
Yep, that's for sure. Jeremy, naturally, we security people tend to say that we're not technical, and we try to stay away from the technical jargons to just make sure that we can bridge the gap between business lingo and financial lingo to make sure we translate that into security lingo. But when it comes to application security, the first word is application, which is 100% technical. You just can't get away with it. How would you convince application security people, application engineers, to talk about security without having to convince them that this is a technical problem? This is something that it's a mindset problem, that they have to adopt it, operationalize it, and retain it. It's not something that you do it during the time I'm watching you over the shoulder. The minute I turn around, you actually throw all of that away and then you go back to doing what you were doing. So what does the balance look like?
Yeah, no, great point. You made some great points there, and kind of piggybacking off a little bit what Carl said. I like how he mentioned that it's about quality and how he kind of evangelizes that. Even from my world, when I was, working for an API and application security company, one of the things we always talked about was having that buy-in effect. As engineers and understanding as developers, they're not necessarily always thinking, Carl mentioned this, not always thinking about security first, right? They're motivated and their driving influences are to create great code, safe code, but great code in sprints, right? They're not necessarily thinking about, I need to embed these different security tests or scans or whatever it might be to get the job done. And I think it really comes down to this whole aspect and concept of collaboration. I think it's also security's vital job and important to making sure that we reach across the aisle and almost sort of a political sense where we're going there and we're including engineers part of our security aspects and reviews, and vice versa, right? Engineering is also, and developers are including security, and say, even something simple as, I saw one organization that said every 2 weeks or every sprint, we were going to include individuals from our security team into our actual, just like our daily or weekly sprints, just to get an idea of kind of what we're building, how we're building it, the language and the jargon that we use, right? Yeah. As we start to really foster this collaborative environment, naturally it starts to become a little bit more embellished when it comes to security and engineering understanding from each other's worlds. But one of the words that we always use, or one of these concepts, is sometimes as security comes in, right, as security professionals, it's like, all right, we got this new tool to process, and so we got this implemented, and people start freaking out, engineering, development, no matter who it is, right? Yeah. And the security is known as typically, right, in the industry as roadblockers, right? Oh, the business is saying no. And I think that also has to change as well, right? Where it's about mitigating but also, having this risk acceptance or risk tolerance policy where things aren't 100% always going to be perfect. And that's, something to understand, even though we might strive for that. It's understanding that at the end of the day, if the business wants to create a new application or they're going to create a new product and I've got 100 or 1,000 developers, assigned to do this, they're going to do it no matter what. right? And security, right? We need to be on board with that, but also still be able to do our job. And so I really do think it comes back to keep it high level, a little bit more of that collaboration to go back. And, we sometimes call it in the industry almost even this concept of purple teaming, right? How do I take some of the red teaming and blue teaming or engineering and development and start to include this fostering of, how is security in everyone's job, right? And naturally that, I think, as you said, Victor, it doesn't happen over day though. It's definitely not a switch of a button. And tomorrow, everyone's thinking about security. I think, we have to build these practices and, build those resources to make sure that it's effective.
The funniest conversation I ever have seen between two engineers, one from security, one from application. Security engineer comes in and asks for, hey, can we do this to ensure that application security is part of your development? And the application security or application engineer guy said, hey, what's the point? Something is going to always get breached. And the flip side of that is where security engineer is saying, well, you're going to create a code which is going to have some sort of flaws already. So what is perfect? Nothing. We just have to work together to continue enhancing both sides. And I think that the takeaway from that funny conversation or funny argument is where both parties have to agree that nothing is perfect here, but together, being collaborative, we can continue to strive on that journey of getting somewhere where if problems occur, we both are together. It's not your problem or my problem, it's together problem for same organization, because that's who we're working for. So then at EpiSec University, you guys have a lot of great content that you're giving it out and for free. Practitioners are seeing this, especially the application engineers are seeing it. And they're like, okay, I can upskill myself. I can learn about security. But they also see a pro and con when it comes to injecting security in their CI/CD pipeline. They also see a delay, a roadblock, if you will, or additional speed bump. What are your thoughts around when you're talking to those people and encouraging them that this is not about short-term gain, it's really about long-term efficiency and effectiveness for your application security?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the market is pretty soundly behind. They want to increase security. They want to move it into the dev pipeline. They want to weave security into the creation of the code. I mean, Carl nailed it, right? Like developers care about the quality of their code. I don't think that's a foreign concept to them, right? They don't want to push code into production that breaks or doesn't function or has vulnerabilities for that matter, right? But historically, security has been kind of a siloed organization. It's that group that comes in after we've written our code and we've done our testing and we've pushed it live, and now it's their job to make sure it keeps it stays safe. And what we've seen with all these breaches is dev and engineering have to be part of the equation, right? Yeah. There's just no way around it, right? If you got a logic flaw in your application, security can't fix that, right? There's no firewall rule that's going to fix that. It's got to go back into the application itself, right? And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is governance, right? We have this simple framework we call the 3 pillars: governance, testing, monitoring. And sometimes we just skip over governance and we go straight into, well, what tools do we need? What do we deploy, right? And governance is, to me, it's all about getting all the constituents together, the product managers, the developers, the security team, risk, and ops, and sit down and talk about how do we build applications and APIs in our organization, and how do we weave security into that, right? Sure. Do we run them in a gateway? Do we have documentation? Do we have a style guide, right? All of this stuff needs to be thought about and documented. But what's really clear, back to your point, is like integrating security into the pipeline. Nobody has an objection to that. I don't get any resistance to that. The biggest challenge I see is this isolation that still exists between security teams and dev teams. Yeah. There's definitely some are good and some are terrible at it, right? When I talk to security teams and they're like, we don't even know what APIs we have, right? Well, I guarantee you, if the VP of Eng was in the room, they would not agree with you. Yeah. Right. It's not an unknown thing. So we've got to build this collaboration between security and dev, and whether it's brown bag lunches, security champions, where you drop people into the dev organization. There's lots of ways to get there, but that collaboration has to be cultivated.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Switching gears here, one of the topics that it's not unheard of, and yet sometimes, at least some of the engagements I've done recently, it's shocking, where AAA, authentication, authorization, auditing, when it comes to application security, is still evolving or maturing. So I want to understand from all of you gentlemen, where when it comes to application security, in order to really, and I come from the world of Cloud Security Alliance, so we have multi-tenancy and separation, isolation to make sure that you can really make your application to a level where you can provide controls. If I need to have just one little knob access read-only to this person, not the whole administrator access, not segmentation isolation is a big thing for us. I want to understand from you, Jeremy, let's start with you. When it comes to authentication, application security, how is that overlapping? I see some concepts where password-less authentication. I see concepts where password should never be part of application security. I want to hear insights from all of you. Authentication, authorization, auditing, when it comes to application security, what are your thoughts around it?
Yeah, Dan actually mentioned it earlier. I think when you look at some of the organizations worldwide that have had security incidences or that have led to breaches via an API security misuse or flaw, more times than not, it's back to the basics of authorization, authentication is what we're talking about here. And, somebody else, I think Carl mentioned it too, like the why. So like I always say, even the who has access to the applications, what has access. That's another thing. We now live in a world where, sometimes we always think like authentication authorization is a human. We also have non-human identities, how two applications talk to each other, or how an API, or how maybe a script is doing something, right? Some machine versus a human. So that's another aspect to see, what is into play there. But as we're going into this, it's really vital for organizations when you're creating applications, when you're in that CI/CD build pipeline, even all the way to the shift right side, or shield right, as what the industry is calling it now, right? When you're looking at real-time threats and real-time protection, it's still, evaluating your applications and APIs for weak authentication, right? Again, it comes back to weak usernames, weak passwords, weak API connections. Even from there, looking at different things like, involving like OAuth tokens or JWT tokens, and, making sure that authorized users only have access to that application or API for when it's needed, right? At that, whether it's a least privilege basis or a need to know basis. I can't tell you how many times, I'm sure Dan and Carl will agree with me, where, I've worked with companies and in the past, and authorization authentication, they'll say, oh yeah, we got it down. We're using tool X, right? Or this sector of it. And it's like, okay, let's do an assessment. And
they have the microscope, they're missing the telescope.
Exactly. I'll leave you with one. I've said this a couple of times in my career, but it's that Spider-Man meme where they all point at each other when it comes to responsibility. And it's like, wait a second, you get them all in a room together. And it's like, so who can authenticate to this application? And it's like, oh, only, this team of developers in this location. And when you start to actually peel back the onion a little bit and understand, look at the basis of it, everybody that had, access into this certain component has access to it or can authorize into it. And so, a couple of different points I just kind of recap there is making sure you're using BEST standards. These guys mentioned it as before, where it's you looking at OWASP or NIST or CIS or even cloud security. There's a lot of great free resources out there that organizations can leverage and toolings, right, that these teams use, including Dan's organization. And so, with that being said, it's also making sure you're putting the best of breed processes and fundamentals of security in general, as far as how you're building and how you're securing, even, I'll kind of make an emphasis here, even post-production, right? So even when those applications, APIs are live and running, not just always in the CI/CD build pipeline or the shift left side as well.
Totally. Absolutely. Carl, your take on this topic, authentication, authorization, auditing, overlapping with application security.
I think the big picture with software in our world today, APIs or let's say it's even just open source software, is that this is a world of dependencies. And so no individual developer developing software to be locally optimal means that it is universally or enterprise optimal. unless it's tested. And so back to Dan's framework, the pillar of testing, testing. And so source code being tested in, static analysis, dynamic analysis, penetration testing, pre-production, all the above, because it's only when you can test that piece of software in the context it's being used. That's when you start to see, for example, like, hey, the developer thought that this authorization scheme was adequate. Okay, they might have been actually accurate, and that might be correct for that one decision of one piece of software that developed, but universally it doesn't work because of the context of the environment or in the context of the user journey that the product needs the user to have to successfully achieve a transaction. And so business context matters. And so that's where testing comes in, because it isn't possible that one person understands all of the moving parts of context of a large organization of open source code. And so it becomes imperative to test and test and test, because smart people could be making the right choices for a local decision on a piece of code, and yet that decision being the wrong one for the enterprise.
Absolutely. Dan, how about you at EpiSec Security, EpiSec University? Sorry, do you guys talk about identity AAA in context of application security?
Yeah, we sure do. Authorization and authentication are two very hot terms. At every API conference I ever go to, if anybody's speaking on either of those topics, the room is jammed full of people.
Yeah,
and I have to say, like, trying to understand these authentication schemes, it's definitely way over my head. The way the tokens pass and the like authorization server and this and scopes and all that stuff, it's really remarkable stuff. All I know is when I want to send money from my phone to somebody else, it just works, right? And all it did was scan my face. So the authentication is really remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
And it's constantly evolving. So it is the technology is improving. Our companies' technologies are coming out to make it more seamless. But the reason why the room's full of people is, these product owners, these developers, they are trying to understand what are these best practices, what can give the best experience, what can actually achieve the greatest level of security, and balance all those three things, because some of those things are in tension. The authorization one is kind of interesting, because I sort of, in my mind, thought, all right, if we need a rule that says Dan should be able to see this, but Carl shouldn't, like, how do you handle that? To me, that just sounds like, sounds like it should live in the application logic itself, right? But that becomes super unmanageable, right? Like, you don't have a central framework. There's no table. There's no policies. It's like everyone is hopefully doing it the right way. And there are now technologies, I'm not all that familiar with them, but that sort of they take authorization rules and bring it outside of the app, and they create another resource. Just like we've taken authentication out of the app. We use OAuth and we use tokens. We use these other things that's what they do, right? So there's a lot to learn here. We've got courses coming on authentication and authorization very soon, which I think will quickly become some of the most popular material on the site. But I think this is a moving space, and if you're dealing with certifying that the user using your technology, your service, is who they say they are, and they're not abusing it or misusing it, you've got to invest the time and learn about these different technologies and how best to use them. Because we still see, right, the number one and number two breach cause are authorization and authentication. Can user A access user B? And frankly, on authentication, we just see so many basic mistakes happening out there, right? And so if we just even elevate a little bit, I think the security of our apps will increase a lot.
And I think traditionally, authentication, authorization, these sort of things were not part of application building. Application building was, hey, I need this functionality. Here is application engineer build it. And then we're like, oh, we need to make sure that we only allow authenticated users, which are external, not internal. So that becomes, okay, we need to add one more function. Then we're like, okay, we need to segment this application so only people who are allowed to go to this record can see it, others cannot. So that becomes RBAC, role-based access control, or attribute-based access control. So now things are evolving, but when application engineer is creating that function, they're like, well, I can't do it all, or I can't think it all. So that's where the part where it's like, okay, bring the security people along the journey so that they can guide you, they can tell you, or even one better, they can actually help you with whatever you need. So I think that's why I see that the space is evolving, where more and more collaboration is coming, because to Carl and Jeremy and Dan, to your point, where application is not just application. To make it stable, secure, you need to have those security folks in the conversation already. So, all right, we're going to wrap up with the key takeaways. Dan, we'll start with you. Give us 3 key takeaways, someone who's starting application security journey or evolving and maturing in their organization. What are 3 things that you would recommend them to definitely look at it?
Oh, geez. Well, I gotta reinforce governance. Like, it seems like a bad word, but like, just get the teams together and just come up with your policies, your process. How are you building APIs in your org, from style guides to gateways to testing to how you're monitoring, all of that stuff, and document it, publish it, get everyone out there to know what your policies are. Education, I couldn't miss that one, right? So there's plenty of great resources out there. There's one right there that you can leverage to learn a whole lot. And I think it's really important that we're educating not just security teams, but developers, right? Yes. And we don't need them to be experts. No way. We just need them to have an understanding how are APIs getting breached out there in the real world, and what are those things that you can do to protect yourself. I got to make a plug for testing. I really believe in shifting left, wiring security into the dev pipeline. We would never, ever push code live that wasn't tested for functionality. That's unheard of. But we're perfectly fine having a once a year pen test. That just doesn't seem right. So we got to weave security testing into the dev pipeline, just like we test for everything else.
Totally. Carl, 3 takeaways, key takeaways.
Well, I think the first takeaway for any professional in this field is be an active participant in the networking this discipline, from ISACA to OWASP to Cloud Security Alliance. First is find your community, because there are people who are actively contributing their knowledge to the greater good. And so be at that table, because that those relationships and that venue, whichever one you choose, that venue is going to be there and persist for decades. And I think that's an extremely important thing to do, is pick a network and commit to it. And then, the second thing, maybe 3 or 4 things, but the second thing is for security professionals, assume the developers know what they're doing. Just take that position as like a default position, which is developers aren't trying to get an organization breached. And so if you come into the application security discipline, every conversation that you have with developers and product owners it is doomed to fail if the assumption is that those people don't know what they're doing. They actually do know what they're doing. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as security professionals to adjust our language, our mindset, and for us to adjust to them. And I think that carries forward in a lot of different ways of setting an organization up for success, is when the security team treats the developers and the product owners with a degree of just professional respect. That's where security professionals can definitely be self-inflicted wounds when they don't do that. So I'll just leave it to those 2.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll take a different approach. It's pretty much the same as what these guys said, but I'll kind of break it down in people, process, technology. People, right? And both of them said it, right? Again, kind of building that culture of security, internally within your organization across all the departments and business units, right? And not looking at security as necessarily the bad guys or the roadblockers or the ones that the business or department is saying no, right? And so that's also on security's duty and responsibility to make sure that we're leveraging and being proactive. Right. I think that's the key word there, being proactive within our organizations and departments. We talked a little bit about security awareness training and that collaboration. Moving on to process. So, Dan mentioned the governance component, but again, goes back to even the visibility component, right? Documenting, cataloging, understanding what is in play, what is in use, what do I have access to, who's accessing it, who's authorizing it, then we can get to more complicated things like the technology aspect. And, we briefly touched upon it, but in this sector, in the API application security, there are a lot of vendors. There's a lot of different segments and aspects within this. And so once you get to that component, it's really about, at the end of the day, this can apply to all different areas of cybersecurity, but really the defense in depth, the defense in layers, putting the provisions and safeguards all the way in your CI/CD pipeline, right? And that's shift left all the way from how you're starting to develop code, even think about creating code, right? How does security become there all the way to real-time production? But in addition to that, right, embellishing your environment where it makes sense to making sure you're mitigating risk as much as possible, right? All the way from how your application is spun up to what it's doing to who it's communicating to. So, you can look at it from that aspect as well, that people, process, technology. And it, like anything, right, it is a crawl, walk, run process, right? This isn't an overnight thing. And there's a lot of great resources, as mentioned throughout this entire podcast, that are available to you.
Couldn't agree more. Again, I think if I were to listen to all of this and I will summarize, walk in with empathy when you're talking to application security people. Don't assume that they're stupid. They know what they're doing. Second, try to upskill themselves and yourself by being in the community, being in the industry, and listening to others as well. Learn from their mistakes, help them as well. If you have made a mistake, contribute to that as well. And third, this space is not something that we need to fight over each other. It's really something that we can share and help each other. I think that's what I'm really taken away with that one. So with that, gentlemen, I really want to thank you all for coming in, giving your insights, and thank you everyone who had tuned in and listened to us today. Thank you very much.